what was the trigger for you to get out there?
I mean, the trigger is there's these horrible injustice going on. And if you ask me the question in different years, I'll give you a different answer. When I spent months in Ferguson, pushing a lot of my work to the side, and a lot of people will tell you the same, I truly believed at that time, no matter how naive it sounds right now, that if just enough people knew what was really going on, not the CNN version, but enough people knew about this police oppression. And when I say people, white people, let's be honest, I'm talking about white people. And the majority of black people know what the hell's going on. So if we just hit a tipping point of white people who knew the horrific police terror that is going on, that it would make some significant change. This is me in 2014. I believe that. I no longer believe that. I believe after we know what's going on, after we see video after video, even after we see George Floyd, and we're taking a back turn since George Floyd and funding police departments even more, I no longer have that same optimism that said, if it's just a matter of awareness. It's not just a matter of awareness. It's so much deeper than that. But awareness is the prerequisite to justice. Awareness won't bring you justice. I used to think that. That's not true, but it's a prerequisite to justice. So I just want to do that part and say, okay, if you know what's going on, if you saw George Floyd, if you saw Walter Scott, if you see the statistics and you know what's going on and you're still not trying to stop police terror, you're still not trying to defund these departments and reroute the resources, then you have a problem. You're the problem right now. That you are knowingly supporting terror. So that's what awareness could do. And after that, you know, there's a lot more that needs to go on as far as activism, but it's one slice.
But what do you think is going to be that tender moment, that moment where the spark hits and an explosion happens, you know, socio-politically? What do you think is going to And do you think it's going to happen within the next 5, 10 years, or you think it's going to take longer? What do you think?
I mean, I've been wrong about it. I thought Ferguson was going to do that. I thought George Floyd is going to do that. Now, there's a historian part of me, and activists will talk to each other and say, well, look at the civil rights movement from 1954 and Brown versus Boardification to 65 and the Civil Rights Act and all of the different events that happened during that time, that these things don't happen like one event or two events. It's a sustained approach. You're going to have backlashes to the progress, and it's going to go back and forth. And those are the vicissitudes of fighting and activism. You have to be in for the long haul. And I get that. I say that. I preach that. I tell people the Montgomery bus boycott lasted a year and 15 days. And if anyone gave up before a year and just said, we gave it our best shot, then it wouldn't have moved forward. So we have a history that we have to draw on to not be so demoralized, right? We have to do that. So it's not good to look at it as one event or another event, but to be in for the long haul. But I will say this, because it's so demoralizing of not seeing the change that you expect to see, and particularly after this George Floyd that we're sliding backwards, right? It's so demoralizing. There are these moments that keep you going that you have to hold on to. And I had a moment this week. And this past week, and it usually comes from a family. This is what sustains me when there's no political movement. I had a family member say, you know what? And I've had this a lot. Through your coverage, I got to know what was going on. And thank you so much. And giving me a hug and wouldn't let go. Well, my daughter was arrested and no one knew what was going on. I was looking at your feed. I was looking at your updates. Thank you for interviewing my daughter afterwards. Thank you for letting me know what's going on with my daughter. And if you get enough of those, and I got a lot of them, whether from participants themselves, say, thank you for giving us a voice. No one else will give us a voice. Those things sustain you. They may not be like the institutional change that we want, but it's something, right? It's something that says, you know what? I know I'm doing the right thing. We ain't there yet. We're not even close to there, but I'm going to keep doing it. And you know what? If all we got this past week is that, that's enough. You know, like that's something. You're making the people's lives in that movement more worthwhile. You're making them feel heard. So that's something to sustain you while you try to go for the macro change.
Okay. Thank you for that, because I honestly sometimes wonder, when will we reach our limit? And sometimes I'm like, is it going to be just extremely slow and gradual? But then I remember talking to Noah Krejcik, the Western Marks, and one of the things he said was, there's a quote where they says, a lot of progress will happen over a long period of time, and then sometimes a huge amount of progress can happen in 1 week.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm still just like waiting for that 1 week, but it's like I have to be comfortable with the slow sustained change, but we also have to be the people that continuously push, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like I have to be more patient in my head while still also being impatient enough to push. Does that make sense? Does that make any sense? I don't know.
It makes total sense. And you're constantly having to recalibrate your expectations. Listen,
Yes.
I know this happened to you. It's happened to me, and it's happened to every activist who's ever lived. You go through these almost near bouts of depression, almost, where you're like, my God, like, what do we got to do to wake this world up, right? Like, you saw this video. This is not okay. This is, whether it's Derek Chauvin, and I don't mean just Derek Chauvin going to jail, and I don't mean the 3 officers who are watching him go to jail, which they should, and that's a very tiny win. But if that happens and you have 3 officers there, and you have Mike Freeman, the DA, who, remember, was trying to protect Derek Chauvin that first week until the uprising happened, that means you have an entire rotten, disgusting, corrupt criminal culture that says it's okay. And if you don't recognize that culture, you don't fight about that culture that goes far beyond Derek Chauvin, and you don't try to remove the money that's subsidizing that culture, well, then we have a problem, and it gets depressing when other people don't see it. So there's this constant recalibration of what you're trying to do and what your expectations are. So I've lowered my expectations to, you know what, if it doesn't create the big change, I know I did right by those protesters. I know I did right by those protesters' families that are not being heard. And that has to be enough, because otherwise you'll bang your head against the wall, you'll go up in a hole, you'll get depressed. I've been depressed, you've been depressed, we've all been depressed. And you just have to lower the expectations to a human level, and anything you get beyond that are bigger wins.
Yeah. I was thinking, as you were explaining, I was thinking of an analogy that I can think about it as, and it's like trying to crack a rock, but everybody has a little hammer and everybody has a little chisel. And as you go to it, you go and you put that hammer and that chisel in, and then you take one hit, and everybody comes in and takes another hit. Boom, boom, boom. You may not have chipped off that much, but if 1,000 people all came behind one another, that is 1,000 chips that, it takes off that boulder. And I think that boulder is the system. But then there'll be that one person that takes that one good chip, and then a huge piece comes off. And so I think that is what I think we're both kind of, circling around as far as this explanation goes. And so that's why I feel like we should have hope. And I think that part of it is in what we cover and how we cover it as well.
Yeah. Can I offer some somewhat hopeful things that came out of 2020 that maybe everybody forgot?
Please do.
Okay. There are positive things that came out of that. Okay. Now, that's before Biden was elected and became a national sedative, which is actually what happened. But before that, we saw colleges across the country kicking police off of their campuses. They had police contracts, and they said, we don't want to have you as a contract anymore. And that was going on all across the country. We saw 3 or 4 localities start to defund the police. I think there was Seattle, they were rerouting to the homeless. There was Austin. There was another. It was happening in these little pockets. It was moving in that direction. I don't know the status right now. We even saw state Colorado say, the governor, we're going to get rid of qualified immunity. Not the biggest thing in the world, but it's something. Progress was going in that direction. And it didn't happen through a legislative vote. It didn't happen through a Congress. It happened through a governor saying that. And these things were happening because of protesters, not through any elected process, through the protesters. And we saw these pockets of change. And then I want to add one other thing, which I think is huge now, even though we don't see it. Particularly shout out to my DC family and protesters. Change the conversation from reform to defund. That defunding the police, removing resources from police, abolish the police, whatever you want to call it, police abolition, has been an idea that has been stuck in the prison of academia, that has been stuck in the prison of activist circles. You know, Angela Davis has been talking about it for decades now. Others have. And it never got mainstreamed. And what happened is the DC protesters mainstreamed it overnight when they wrote Black Lives Matter equal defund the police. And it was in such big letters. And I was out there the night that happened. It was in such huge letters. The media, the CNNs, your MSNBC, they could not ignore it because you had these shots from over above. And if you looked at media overnight, you started hearing about defund the police. The Overton window changed. Now we can actually discuss it and not be seen as a crazy person. Like, you can do that. You have scholars who've been talking about it, and now we can have reasonable discussions. And you even have pockets of people even running on. And that could only happen from those protesters. Those protesters mainstreamed it. So
you were talking about, you know, the onset of protests that really makes the change as far as what, you know, the national conversation is. You were talking about, you know, regarding defund the police, which I have, you know, for me, it was a transformation to hear more about police abolition and the way that we know it. So it actually helped me a lot to understand how the carceral system actually works. Yeah. You know what? And I think we have to approach it, you know, the best way. A lot of people find it so unreasonable, but they don't find unreasonable that white supremacists are on the street and murdering people. Like, that's not unreasonable to them. And I don't get that. But what is reasonable to me, and the number of people, abolitionists, take this approach, is instead of everyone starts the conversation with, what about the murderers? What about the rapists, right? Everyone starts it, and that's the wrong way to start it. You start the conversation with, what about all the calls that have nothing to do with violent crime, which is, like, depending where, over 80% of calls. Why can't we remove all those calls to specialists who get paid like half the price, who don't retire at 50, don't have $1 million pensions, and are twice or 3 times as qualified and won't murder you in the process? So if it's a mental health call, have a mental health specialist. Have more school counselors who could work on de-escalation. Have people who are trained at de-escalation, not incentivized for escalation. And if you do that and you have the conversations not of violent crime, but the vast majority of police calls that have nothing to do with violent crime, then we could talk more freely. So there's no reason anyone shouldn't be on board with, say, cutting the police departments in half overnight and using those resources in other ways. I mean, if they're not bought off by the police union, which every politician is. But you get my point. The point is, intellectually, it is a rational conversation that people have made irrational when they're the irrational ones for supporting terror. Well, I mean, if we're going to look at it, you know, let's be more data driven when we look at these things.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, you know, some people, you know, cite data, but the thing is, they'll cite inaccurately. Like, for instance, people want to talk about 13% of the population commit 50% of the crimes, when in reality, it's like, okay, if that's the case, then why do we, you know, Black people have the highest exoneration rates?
Right. That's true. And I like to talk about, you know, crime last, and so much of that crime is preventable, right? If you're giving people their basic needs. So you don't give people their basic needs, and crime elevates. But we have to question the as many people do, that even police solve crime and stop crime, because we see they don't. When they have huge police forces, it's not having an impact either way. What police do is serve themselves. They serve their own budget, and I would argue create crime because they starve other resources. They remove other resources that are more preventive of crime. So, when I'm covering McPherson Square in DC, and they're getting rid of all of the unhoused in the tents in DC, well, I see a bigger problem here. And I see the criminals as the police who are getting rid of them. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to see more housing. I'd like to see so many more basic needs, more health care. Those are the conversations we need to have.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was that we're trying to keep this in the conversation, in the ether, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise that people know that I'm on the left. I don't want to speak for you, but the thing is that what do you see that could be better as far as our communication on the left when it comes to these issues of policing, housing, education, foreign policy? What improvements do you think that you see that we could make?
I mean, all of the above. Are you talking about messaging, communication, or the issues themselves?
Messaging, communication, as well as coming together instead of having a constant infighting. And especially see this with the online left, especially.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because I've been feeling like an island the last year. Many people have been a little bit, because there's so many, people arguing with each other. And a lot of times, I'm going to be honest, I see a lot of people going back and forth, and I like the work both of them do, right? I like the work, and I don't really want to pick a side, because I like the work you do here. I like the work you do here. We're all flawed. I'm flawed. I've tweeted some stuff from 2-3 years ago. Hell, maybe even 6 months ago. I'm like, why did I even say that dumb shit? We make mistakes, and I think we have to understand that we make mistakes, or that we evolve, and how do we deal with that? So, I'm a little bit old school, right, in activism, and I say old school in the sense that if I have a problem with someone who I respect their body of work, I'm going to DM them. I'm going to call them up. I'm going to get them on the phone. Hey, listen, man, I know you've done good work. I know you've done great work. And we're not going to agree on everything. But on this particular one, I do vehemently disagree. I want to tell you why. And let do what you want with it, right? You have these calls. And I think part of what has happened, where so many of the divisions are brought online, is those steps are skipped. I'm not going to act like activists never argued in the past, and that's never existed. That's always existed. Mm-hmm. But I think part of going online, certain steps are skipped. And when steps are skipped, it is much harder for me to have a conversation when everyone else is jumping in at the same time. Now you're kind of flexing for other people rather than, trying to resolve an issue. So I've seen it with activists, like even in DC covering George Floyd, there would be two organizations that would be arguing with each other. And I'm like, nobody outside of DC knows any of this. Everyone here is DC Black Lives Matter to everyone outside of DC. Nobody knows all the different organizations. So you always have that going on. And then it's reached podcast level. So now we have 457 different leftist groups, and who you're with and who you're not with. So I'm not saying my way is the right way. I'm just telling you what I do. I like to do stuff behind the scenes, and I'd like to see a little bit more of those steps before we go bam online. That's just how I feel about it personally. Mm-hmm. Because if someone does good work, we have to respect the body of work, right? Yeah. That's how I feel. I vehemently disagree with everyone all the time. That's going to happen. But is your body of work good? And if your body of work is good, then let me judge you on that, not whatever the 10% we may vehemently disagree.
Of course. What about the messaging as far as the left? What do you think that we could do better?
So I say this as a reformed liberal. I'm a reform liberal, right? There's no argument a liberal can make that I haven't already previously argued on in terms of pragmatism and how do we move forward, and we have to take some steps instead of nothing. I know all those arguments. Again, this is my personal view. Like, there are a lot of liberals who could be more leftist, for lack of a better word, or we could bring along if we didn't always call them stupid idiots. All right, because in many ways I try to change my language. It's easy, right? It's maddening. Sometimes you'll just trust me. I'm guilty, right? It's maddening sometimes because you see the same behavior over and over. But I always have to remind myself, I was that person. So am I going to shun who I used to be? Who I used to be. I can't shun who I used to be. I got to try to bring people along if they're close, and I can't necessarily call them an idiot because they may have real fears. Like, a lot of times intellectually they're with you, but they have some real fears, which makes them beholden to a guy like a Joe Biden who has horrible policies and whatnot. So I think for me, it's being able to try to communicate, and not everyone's an idiot. Now, we have to separate those who are trying in good faith. I always try to do this, and it's very hard. But who's a good faith disagreeer, and who's a bad faith disagreeer? And if they're bad faith, I got no time for them. I just got no time for it because you're not even trying to find truth. But there are a segment of people who are legitimately trying to find the truth, and they're just misguided. And that group, I mean, you got to bring along, because do I want to be part of a group of leftists that are right about all this and right about that, but we're like talking to ourselves all the time? I'm tired of talking to people who think like me. I want to grow. We have to grow. We have to grow. As an anti-war activist, I've been looking at the same 200 people for 10 years now. I'm tired of looking at the same 200 people. How do we grow, right? What do you do? And I can say that for a number of issues. And part of the reason is we can't call everyone an idiot. We just can't call everyone an idiot because they're not getting it. That's just me. But some people disagree with that, but whatever.
Yeah. I go back to, and I love when he said this, and may he rest in peace, Michael Brooks.
Yeah.
And Michael Brooks said, "Be kind to others, but be ruthless to systems and institutions."
Yes.
I think that goes a far way. Now, with dishonest actors, it's just like, you know what? Ain't got time for you. I'm gonna move into a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one thing, and I've said this in private conversations to friends who are in this space, and I've said, they're not my enemy. Racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, this Western supremacy, these things are my enemy. Capitalism is my enemy. So therefore, I'm going to fight this to change the system so that people are better off. You may have people that are speed bumps along the way, but they're just speed bumps because they're propaganda, they're brainwashed into being speed bumps.
Right.
So I could either, just move them out of the way and say, you know what, I'm going to keep going forward, or I could teach them in a kind way and say, look, this is what I think you're getting wrong. And then I'll teach them and plant seeds in their mind. But if they still don't get it, then I'm going to let you sit with that for a while.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep moving in my direction.
I agree.
Because I think that if I have the correct idea, I'm going to eventually, it's going to come to fruition that I have the correct idea.
Yeah.
So.
No, I agree with that. And you have to mobilize, and we can learn a lot from right wingers as far as strategy goes, right? They're far ahead. Yeah, I forget their ideas, because basically the right wing in this country, main idea is how do we keep this country white, and everything is essentially built around that form of white supremacy in one way or another, right? And so, but they're fighting for something. I mean, they're fighting to keep this country white, and by any means necessary. And the problem is, when we're talking about, or how we view the left, or I want to separate maybe leftists from liberals in the Democratic Party.
Sure.
They're not fighting for anything instead of not being as bad as Trump, or not being as bad as DeSantis, or not being as bad as that bad Republican. They're fighting for nothing. And the reason we have gone right and gone white over the last 40 years is because when you fight for nothing, the scale will keep going the other way. So we have to stay on the issues. We got to stay on Medicare for all, on human rights, on being anti-war, on against police terror. We have to fight for these, and for housing for all, for college tuition for all. These are ideas, right? These are policies, right? So we got to stay on these policies and focus on these policies that are grounded in human rights. So you have one side is grounded in white supremacy and the other is grounded on human rights. We have to stay focused on those. And we don't do that. And I don't know who, when I say we, let's just say that the two parties, there is a right-wing party and a more right-wing party. And they are much better at moving that direction because they fight for something. So I don't believe you could ever win anything if your political paradigm is we're not as bad as them. No.
Absolutely. I think this is why a lot of us would say, well, if you're a liberal, you're still right wing. But a lot of liberals will be like, no, we believe in all these things. And I'm like, yeah, that's the floor.
That's the floor. But here's the thing. It's, yeah, that's the floor. But if liberals defined by following the Democratic Party, it's not that you believe in those things. You don't believe in those things. Because if Joe Biden takes Josh Hawley's amendment to put 100,000 more police on the street, then you're actually not against police terror. So like we got to fight. I always say Trump's bigotry is in his words, Biden's bigotry is in his budget. You got to do a little bit of work. Yes.
I gotta run. I gotta go. This is. Ooh, look. I'm gonna clip that one.
Clip it. I say it all the time. Trump's bigotry is in his words, Biden's bigotry is in his budget. So you got to do a little work. Why are you increasing the ICE budget? Why? Why are you increasing the police budget? Why? Why are you increasing the military budget? Why? All forms of white supremacy, by the way. All forms of white supremacy. Why were you for pro-mass incarceration in the 80s, even to the right of Reagan? Why? Why is every policy when you've ever been in power to go to the right of the most right Republican? Why? You got to look at the fine print. And the fine print is that he's a hardcore right-winger, but he talks and he says something different.